In a time of uncertainty, when Israel longed for a king to be like other nations, God decided to grant the people's request. And it was then that an unknown young man from the tribe of Benjamin entered the story. Saul, son of Kish. Tall and imposing, he drew attention for his appearance, but no one could imagine that this shy and insecure young man was about to be chosen as the first king of Israel. The story begins in an unusual way. Kish's donkeys had gone missing, and Saul, accompanied by a servant, went in search of the animals. What seemed like a simple search turned into a divine encounter. After wandering through unknown lands without success, the servant suggested that they consult a man of God who lived nearby. This man was Samuel, the prophet who guided Israel. What Saul didn't know was that God had already revealed to Samuel that he was about to meet the king of Israel. When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord confirmed, "This is the man who will govern my people." At a special dinner, Samuel reserved for Saul the best seat and the best portion of food, signaling that something great was about to happen. The next day, Samuel anointed Saul in secret, pouring oil on his head and declaring, "The Lord has anointed you as leader of his inheritance." At that moment, Saul still didn't understand the magnitude of his calling. He was just a young man who, deep down, didn't feel worthy of such a responsibility. But God had already drawn a purpose for his life. Thus, the simple act of looking for donkeys became the beginning of a journey that would forever change the history of Israel. Saul was still trying to process Samuel's words when the unexpected began to happen. The prophet told him that upon leaving, he would find 3 signs that would confirm his choice as king. And so it was. On the way back, he met men who gave him bread and wine, others who spoke of his mission, and finally a group of prophets. When he joined them, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Saul, and he began to prophesy, something totally unexpected for those who knew him. The people were amazed. Is Saul also among the prophets? Even after these signs, Saul was still an insecure man. When Samuel called all the people together to announce the new king, God used a lottery to publicly confirm his choice. Tribe by tribe, family by family, until Saul's name was called. But at the crucial moment, he had disappeared. They looked for him everywhere until God revealed, "He is hidden among the baggage." It was a clear sign that Saul did not feel prepared. However, when he finally appeared before the people, his imposing appearance impressed everyone. Samuel proclaimed, "See the man the Lord has chosen. There is no one like him among all the people." The people then shouted in unison, "Long live the king!" Saul's first challenges came quickly. The Ammonites, an enemy people, threatened the city of Jabesh-Gilead. When the news reached him, something changed. The Spirit of the Lord filled him with courage, and with holy fury he summoned Israel to battle. His army marched together, and Saul won a resounding victory. This triumph was a turning point. Now, Saul was not just a man chosen by God, but a king recognized by the people. Samuel renewed the coronation, offering sacrifices and reaffirming that if Saul and Israel obeyed the Lord, they would prosper. But if they strayed, they would suffer the consequences. The king was crowned. The future, however, was still uncertain. Saul's reign began with victories, but as time went by, he faced challenges that would test his obedience and character. The greatest of these arose when the Philistines, powerful enemies of Israel, rose up to war. Their army was overwhelming, thousands of chariots, horsemen, and countless soldiers. Faced with this threat, the Israelites were terrified. Many fled and hid in caves, while others crossed the Jordan, abandoning Saul's army. With only 600 men by his side, Saul anxiously waited for Samuel in Gilgal. The prophet had promised to arrive in 7 days to offer sacrifices to the Lord before the battle. But the days passed, and Samuel did not appear. The people were restless, deserting little by little. Fear took hold of the king's heart. Then, in a rash act, Saul decided to take the situation into his own hands. He offered the sacrifice to the Lord, something that only priests and prophets were allowed to do. As soon as he finished, Samuel arrived. The prophet looked at Saul severely and asked, "What have you done?" Saul tried to justify himself. He said that the soldiers were leaving, that the Philistines were ready to attack, and that Samuel was late in arriving. He thought he was acting for the good of the people, but Samuel answered him with harsh and prophetic words. "You acted foolishly. If you had obeyed, God would have established your kingdom forever. But now, the Lord has already sought a man after his own heart to reign over Israel." That was Saul's first major failure. He trusted more in his own haste than in God's direction, and although he still continued on the throne, his rejection had already begun. Time passed, and Saul continued on the throne, but something within him was not the same. His heart, which once showed humility, was now increasingly inclined towards his own will. Then came a new test, a new call to obey, and this time his decision would change everything. God ordered Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites, an enemy people of Israel who had attacked the Hebrews in the past. Samuel brought the clear message, "Go and destroy everything. Spare nothing and no one." This was a direct order from the Lord, and there was no room for interpretation. Saul gathered his army and marched against the Amalekites, winning a resounding victory. But at the moment of carrying out the divine order, he hesitated. Instead of eliminating everything according to the command, Saul spared Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and kept the best of the cattle and sheep. His justification: he wanted to offer the animals as a sacrifice to the Lord. When Samuel arrived, Saul ran to meet him, full of confidence, and declared, "I have obeyed the Lord." But Samuel looked around and asked ironically, "Then why do I hear the bleating of sheep and the lowing of cattle?" Saul tried to justify himself, saying that he had kept the animals to sacrifice them. But Samuel interrupted him with words that would echo throughout history. "Does the Lord have more pleasure in sacrifices than in obedience? Obedience is better than sacrifice." At that moment, Saul realized the gravity of what he had done, but it was too late. Samuel announced that God had rejected his reign and that another, more worthy, would be chosen to govern Israel. Overcome with despair, Saul tried to hold Samuel by force, tearing a piece of his cloak. The prophet looked at him and declared, "Thus the Lord has torn from you the kingdom of Israel." From that day on, Saul was no longer God's chosen one. His reign would continue for a while, but his downfall had already been decreed. Saul was still on the throne, but God's favor was no longer with him. And as his authority crumbled, another name began to shine in Israel: David, a young shepherd whom God had chosen to be the next king. The destiny of the two was intertwined, and the encounter between them would change history forever. The scene was a battlefield. The army of Israel trembled before Goliath, the Philistine giant who challenged any man to face him. No warrior had the courage to accept the challenge, not even Saul, who was once the tallest and most imposing among the Israelites. But then, an unknown young man appeared among the ranks and with unwavering faith knocked down the giant with a single stone. David became a national hero. People sang, "Saul has killed thousands, but David tens of thousands." These words were like poison to Saul's heart. From that moment on, envy began to consume him. What started as admiration turned into fear. Saul realized that God's favor was on David, and the idea of losing the throne tormented him. At the height of his jealousy, he tried to kill David with a spear while the young man played the harp to calm him. But David dodged, and the spear stuck in the wall. It wasn't just envy. Something deeper was corroding Saul. The Spirit of the Lord was no longer with him, and an evil spirit tormented him. His mind was filled with paranoia, and his anger against David only grew. He tried to deceive him, offering his daughter in marriage as a trap, hoping that the Philistines would kill him. But David continued to prosper. The king, who one day had been chosen by God, now became a man obsessed with destroying the one the Lord had raised, and the persecution was just beginning. Saul could no longer hide his anger. The jealousy he felt for David had turned into obsession. He saw the young man not only as a rival, but as a direct threat to his throne. His desire to kill David was no longer a secret. Now, it was a mission. David in turn realized that he was not safe. Jonathan, Saul's son and his best friend, tried to intercede for him, arguing that David had never done anything against the king. For a moment, Saul swore that he would not kill him, but this promise lasted little. Soon after, the king tried to pierce David with a spear again. This time, the young man fled to save his life. Thus began one of the most relentless persecutions in biblical history. Saul used entire armies to hunt down David, forcing him to live as a fugitive. David hid in caves, deserts, and foreign cities. Wherever he went, Saul followed him, determined to end him. But no matter how hard he tried, Saul couldn't capture him. In a dramatic moment, David had the perfect chance to kill Saul. The king entered a cave to rest, unaware that David and his men were hiding there. David's followers encouraged him to kill Saul, but he refused. Instead, he cut a piece of the king's cloak in silence. When Saul left, David appeared and showed the piece of cloth, proving that he could have killed him, but chose not to. Moved, Saul wept and admitted, "You are more righteous than I. I know that you will be king of Israel." Despite this moment of apparent reconciliation, Saul's hatred did not disappear. He continued his persecution, refusing to accept the destiny that God had drawn. His heart was completely hardened, and his end was approaching. Time passed, and Saul, once a powerful king, was now completely consumed by fear and despair. God no longer spoke to him. Neither dreams, nor priests, nor prophets gave him answers. The Philistines had gathered a huge army to attack Israel, and Saul, without direction, saw his reign crumble before his eyes. Desperate for guidance, he made an unthinkable decision. Although he had expelled the mediums and diviners from the country, now he himself sought one of these prohibited practices. Disguised, he traveled to Endor to consult a woman known for communicating with the dead. When he arrived, he asked her to invoke the spirit of Samuel, the prophet who had once anointed him as king. The woman hesitated, but as she performed the ritual, something unexpected happened. Samuel actually appeared. Startled, she realized that this disguised man was King Saul himself. The spirit of Samuel looked at Saul and said bitter words, "Why do you disturb me? The Lord has already abandoned you. He has taken the kingdom from you and given it to another, to David. Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." These words struck Saul like a death sentence. The king fell to the ground, powerless, taken by terror. That night the sorceress gave him food to regain his strength, but nothing could change what was about to happen. Saul had begun his journey as God's chosen one, but now he was consulting a sorceress in the dark. His destiny was sealed. The next day would be the last of his life. The sun rose over the battlefield, and Saul's fate was sealed. The Philistine army advanced with relentless force, and Israel was at a great disadvantage. The demoralized Israelite soldiers fought without hope, knowing that God was no longer with their king. The combat was brutal. One by one, Saul's warriors fell, until his own sons, including Jonathan, were killed. With each blow from the enemies, Saul saw his world crumble. The king, who one day had been anointed by Samuel himself, was now alone, surrounded, and without a way out. The Philistine archers found him, and the arrows pierced his body. Wounded and powerless, Saul knew that the end was inevitable. He looked at his armor-bearer and ordered, "Take your sword and kill me, so that these uncircumcised ones do not mock me." But the young man, terrified, did not have the courage to raise his hand against the king. Then Saul took his own sword, placed it firmly on the ground, and threw himself on it. The first king of Israel, who had begun his journey with great promises, ended his days in defeat and despair. His armor-bearer, seeing the king dead, followed his example and also took his own life. The next day, the Philistines found the bodies of Saul and his sons on the battlefield. As an act of humiliation, they cut off his head and hung his body on the walls of the city of Beth-shean. The man who should have been a faithful leader to the Lord was now a trophy in the hands of the enemies. But even in death, Saul still had loyal followers. The men of Jabesh Gilead, remembering how the king had saved them in the past, risked their lives to recover their bodies. They took them to their city and gave them a dignified funeral. Saul's reign was over. The throne of Israel now awaited the man God had chosen to replace him, David. Saul's reign ended tragically, but his story was not forgotten. His name was marked not only by his failures, but also by his early years of leadership, when he was still a strong and obedient king. For a time, he protected Israel from enemies, led victorious battles, and united the tribes under one government. However, his wrong choices sealed his fate. Saul's biggest problem was not a lack of talent or courage, but his inability to fully trust God. He began as a humble man, even insecure, but over time he let fear and pride govern his decisions. When God gave him clear instructions, he tried to modify them in his own way, believing that he could balance his own will with partial obedience. But God does not accept half obedience. David, the young man he had persecuted so much, did not forget the importance of Saul. Even after taking the throne, David never spoke badly of him. On the contrary, when he received the news of Saul's death, he wept bitterly and composed a lament in his honor. "O Israel, your glory lies wounded on the mountains, how the mighty have fallen." He recognized that despite his mistakes, Saul had been the Lord's anointed. But Saul's story also left a warning for the kings who would come after him. Those who turn away from God sooner or later reap the consequences. His reign began with a great promise, but ended with a solemn warning about the dangers of disobedience and pride. With his death, Israel entered a new chapter. Now, the throne belonged to David, the man after God's own heart, and through him, the lineage that would one day bring the Messiah to the world began to establish itself. Saul's story is one of the most dramatic in the Bible. He began as an ordinary man, chosen by God for a great purpose, but ended his life in defeat, hopelessness, and loneliness. His journey teaches us valuable lessons about leadership, obedience, and the danger of pride. The first great lesson is that obeying God is more important than anything else. Saul seemed to follow the Lord's orders, but always left a detail behind, thinking that he could mold God's plans to his own will. His disobedience in the war against the Amalekites was the decisive point that made God reject him as king. He thought that offering sacrifices would be enough, but he heard from Samuel a harsh truth: obedience is better than sacrifice. Another fundamental lesson is about how we react to the success of others. Saul was jealous of David because he saw in him everything he had lost. Instead of recognizing his own mistakes and seeking repentance, he decided to persecute the one God had chosen. His pride and insecurity turned him into a bitter man, willing to do anything to stay in power. We also learn that turning away from God brings inevitable consequences. At the beginning, Saul had the Spirit of the Lord upon him, but over time, his disobedience and impatience caused God to withdraw. Without divine guidance, he began to act impulsively, taken by fear, and reached the point of consulting a sorceress. But perhaps the biggest lesson of all is that a good start does not guarantee a good end. Saul was chosen by God, anointed by Samuel, and had incredible opportunities. However, his story ended in tragedy because he did not persevere in fidelity to the Lord. His name remains recorded in history, not as an example to be followed, but as a warning to those who start well, but do not maintain their trust in the God who called them. If you like biblical stories like this one about Saul, I invite you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos. Leave your like and share this video with a friend. May God bless you.